I think the question just before highlighted, as well as the debate before, highlighted the importance of data. And we also heard in the keynotes about that. So I want to give you a few insights in the data standardization that is needed and that is already to some parts available, at least for some parts of the data. And when we talk about data, it's a manifold of data, actually. I mean, you have all the functional measurement data from the experiments, you have the endpoint measurements also, and then you have the process data from your MPS system, and you then have to collect and finally also to integrate that. And also in the debate, it was highlighted, as well as in the keynotes, the connection to the modeling. And here, interestingly, you can make a bridge also via the standardization, because when you then collect your data, then what in the end you might want to do is to simulate models. So you have to set up models. For that, you have to integrate all this data, and the data has to fit. And then when you simulate the data and go back to your experimental results and make refinements and eventually start a process again, yeah, that all needs a certain degree of standardization. And the data types that are relevant here for the MPS systems are data and metadata, so data describing the data actually on the biological samples and the sampling. So it all starts actually with the biological material. Then you have the sensor data and the endpoint measurements, so biophysical data, physiological data, toxicology data, chemical and biochemical data also, bioactivities, omics data. I mean, we heard about the connections to the omics world also before, and the imaging data, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you have all the different kinds of measurements here. And then you have the process data from the devices, the tissue or cell culture data, microenvironment data, and the like. And when you couple that to the modeling, computational modeling, you have also the modeling and simulation data. And when you use human samples, medical data also comes into play. So you have a whole range of data that needs to be standardized in order to fit to each other. And the challenges here for the data processing and integration also are that you want to integrate across the technological silos. So the data from the different parts and from the different readouts have to fit to each other, to be interoperable, to interface with each other. And the devices, I mean, you heard about coupling of devices just before, and the devices also have to be interoperable and exchange data. And then for the data analysis workflows, they also have to be standardized and harmonized in order to fit to each other. That's another challenge here. There's a need for the data provenance standards. So provenance means that you trace back data to the original source, the original material, but also to the original raw data and pre-processed data. You also have the need for metadata standards. So metadata are these data that describe actually the data that comes out from your measurements and from your experiments. That includes also the terminology. So which terms you use to describe your system, your readouts, and all that, as well as data quality standards. The data access sometimes needs to be controlled, not only for proprietary issues, but also when you think of human data. I mean, it's highly controlled very often, the access to these data. And that are all these challenges that you have to face here. To put it in one word, what you have to achieve is to make the data fair. Fair means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That does not mean that it's completely open, it means that it's really findable for everybody who has the right to find it, and accessible to everybody who has the right to access that and the like. And to make the data actually fair, you have platforms. I mean, we developed with partners of the team of Carol Goebel from University of Manchester in the UK. At HITS, we developed the Seek platform over the last 15 years, actually, in the context of the FAIRDom initiative. And there we have established a platform that is used by many consortia in Europe, but also worldwide and locally used for data management to actually structure data models, SOPs, so standard operating procedures, and other information on the assays. And the structuring is also done in a way that the data that belongs to other data can be found together. So you can structure data from assays that belong together or that were done based on the same material into studies, and several studies can be grouped into investigations. So there's a standard even for that, the ISA standard, investigation study assay standard, that can be used here and that we have implemented in the system. And there you can then find actually the data that you are looking for. So it's also implementing controlled access and all that I mentioned for the challenges in the beginning. For actually making the data fair, you have different tools and different things that you can use actually to make the data fair. So to make it findable, you need to use rich metadata, persistent identifiers for the parts of your data. Persistent means that the identifier does not change over the time. You need indexed data repositories, et cetera, to make that data findable. To make it accessible, you need standard communication protocols, you need authentication processes when needed, and also the metadata needs to be consistently available. To have the data then interoperable, you need to use standardized vocabularies, you need to use linked metadata, so metadata catalogs that provide also a set of minimal information that you need to describe a certain aspect of your data or of your experiment. And finally, to make the data reusable also, I mean, you want to connect that to other results and you want to integrate that, for example, for the computational modeling, as I mentioned in the beginning. The metadata have to have really multiple attributes, minimum information catalogs of the attributes describe a minimum set of metadata that needs to be there for a certain data type. And also the data provenance, I already mentioned that is really relevant. For actually tackling the fairness of the data, you have a whole forest of standards in the life sciences for describing data, but also for formatting data. And these standards can be grouped in three major categories. So one category is the data format, actually. So to make the data also available for machine access, not only for human access, it needs to be formatted in a standardized way to actually describe in a consistent way the biological context and also what the data is about. You have also terminologies for the semantic descriptions of the data content and of the biological material behind. And finally, you have also minimal information catalogs. I mentioned that before. So guidelines, what kind of metadata is needed for what kind of data. And this forest of standards is really complex. You have hundreds of formats for the data, hundreds of terminologies and hundreds of guidelines, because you have all the different subdomains, all the different technologies that you have to apply in your system. And so it's really a forest that you hardly can look through. So there was one missing, no, okay. To give you a few examples, here I picked one example from the modeling world of such standards, and they are very often driven by the scientific communities as grassroots standards. So they are just developed fit for purpose that is needed to standardize a certain type of data. In this example here, you see the modeling systems biology markup language, SBML, and this can be used to have a standardized description of computational models of biological systems. I don't want to go into detail here, but this is a standard that was actually, as a grassroots standard, developed from the scientific community in order to exchange computational models on biological systems. And this can be used for different kinds of computational models. And another example that I want to show you is an approach to actually standardize the visual display, so the visualization of biological pathways and biological models. It's a systems biology graphical notation, SBGN, and there you can have different levels of detail to describe actually your model, a very detailed process description map, a less detailed, more information flow model for the entity relation, so which entities in the model connect logically, and then a very bird's eye view display in a standardized way of the information flow, the activity flow. And that can be compared to the electrical engineering field, where engineers have developed standardized ways of displaying electric circuit diagrams, and that can be also used quite interestingly in the life science field here to standardize the visualization of biological models. And a third and last example from the community standards is the synthetic biology open language, ESBO, that is used to actually connect lab automation systems, laboratory information management systems, and high throughput systems to repositories and databases, and also to connect the data of these systems and the repositories to the modeling world. You also can exchange their sequence information and corresponding information in a standardized way. And so you have this whole forest of the standards coming from the scientific world, defined as grassroots standards, and how to look through all these standards. You need some kind of guidance here, and that's why we established more than 10 years ago the Combine Network, Computational Modeling in Biology Network, that comprises the most used standards in the field and harmonizes them to become more interoperable. That comprises standards for knowledge representation like SBOL, what I showed you, standards for visual representation like SBGN, but also standards for the models themselves like SBML, and corresponding activities like controlled vocabularies and other infrastructures. Then you find some resources in the web to actually help you looking through the forest of standards, like a fair sharing portal, and there you can find collections of domain-specific standards, like the Combine collection for the modeling standards. You can find also the implementation of the standards in databases and tools and repositories, like here shown in the how that works. Okay, like you find here in the orange dots in this graph, and then you find information on the standards themselves. and how they are implemented and in the tools and also related standards. Another world actually of the standardization is a more formal world of the standardization. We heard from the Senelec group, from Andres just before. Internationally, we have ISO, the International Standardization Organization, and especially here for the field, the ISO Technical Committee 276 Biotechnology, that defines standardization in the field of biotechnology processes and includes terms and definitions, biobanks and bioresources, analytical methods, bioprocessing, but also data processing, annotation, analysis, validation, comparability, and integration. And that is also reflected by the composition of this committee with 5 working groups that deal with these different aspects, that, as I mentioned, and I lead the working group 5, data processing and integration of this ISO technical committee. And in this working group, we define standards for traceable, searchable, and interoperable data for biotechnology and the life sciences. And this is quite a parallel effort that fits really well with the FAIR guiding principles that I introduced to you before. And the focus here in the working group of this ISO committee is the definition of data and model formats and their interfaces, but also the definition of metadata and the relations of data and models, and also quality management of processed data and models. And we have about 150 committee members currently in this working group. I mean, the whole ISO committee has much more attendees there. And in my working group, we have 23 countries coming together. So it's really an international effort that tries to standardize these data. One example that is quite relevant, I think, for the MPS world is the ISO 26691 draft, that a standard that is coming out this year as a published standard, ISO standard, and it defines requirements for data formatting and description in the life sciences. It can be considered as a meta standard for data formatting, description, reporting, integration, and sharing. So as a catalog of criteria and requirements for those formats, for data formats, and also the semantic data description, and this as a prerequisite, for a framework of interoperable standards when you think of the forest of standards that you connect the trees in the forest. And one example why this is really so important is an analog from the world of fire. There was a great fire in the city of Baltimore here in the US in 1904, and the whole city burned down there. The problem was at that time you had 600 different variations of hose couplings for the fire hydrants. And that means that the fire brigades of one district in town could not help to fight the fire in another district, not to speak about fighters that came from far away from other cities. So the whole city could not be saved because the firefighters could not connect their hoses to the fire hydrants. I think that is quite a good analog to our world here, because we have all this different kind of data that have to come together here. And you can see this data connections, the interoperability as the hoses that need to be coupled to the hydrants, to the platforms that you use, to the experimental platforms, the MPS platforms. And also the different readouts that you have, they also have to fit to each other. And this is what we try to structure in this ISO draft that will become a published standard this year. It's a reference framework standard for community data standards, and really defines the requirements and rules for the concerted application of such community standards for the formatting, but also for the description and documentation of data types, of different types of data actually in the life sciences. It also defines a catalog of criteria and requirements for such interoperable life science data formats. And I don't want to go through all, for the sake of the time, through all the specifics of this. I mean, you can read the standard once it's out. I guess you will find a lot of important information there. The table of content shows you that it's not only defining the requirements for the technical and organizational recommendations for the data formats and the semantic recommendations, but also refers to examples of common formats for life sciences, life science data, sorry, and for the minimum reporting standards for data models and metadata. And as an example, you should not read that now, but just that you get an impression how such a standard looks like. I picked an example of a minimum consensus information for the annotation of biological data. So this chapter describes how minimum consensus information should be used for annotation of biological data, and also it defines. Oops, sorry. Can I go back? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, you can read that. And in the annex, as I mentioned, you have already 250 or more standards referenced here, formats like the SBML format that I mentioned in the beginning, or minimum information standards and terminologies. And these are, so the printed standard is actually complemented by a kind of live annex available online in the fair sharing platform that I mentioned before. And there you have the ISO 26691 collection of standards with all the 250 and more standards that are referenced there. And the advantage of such a live annex, an online platform, is that it can be constantly updated and maintained. I mean, when you think of all these community standards, they change over time. And so this cannot be really well reflected in the printed standard. And such a live annex platform can help to actually be updated in the future. I think I skipped the last example that I wanted to show you for the data provenance. It's a quite early stage development in the ISO working group that describes the history of biological samples and the data history. You are welcome to also contribute to that. I think it's quite relevant for the MPS technology too. So what I wanted to show you is actually that formal and community standards both are relevant and important for describing data in the MPS world, but also in the whole world of biological data and biotechnological data. Thank you.